There are timestamps down in the description box below in case you want to skip certain parts of this video to the parts that you would find to be more interesting. Also, if you're new here, please click that subscribe button because it helps me to create more content like this in the near future. And if you have any unpopular opinions or hot takes on any movies, follow me on Instagram and we can be able to have a decent conversation on that platform as well. Now, with that being said, let's go ahead and get started talking about some unpopular opinions on horror movies. In case you didn't know, I went over onto Instagram and put a post on there asking people what were their unpopular opinions on any horror movies that they have watched. And I got a collection of 6 comments that I'm going to discuss in this video, but before I do that, I'm going to go ahead and tell you guys my unpopular opinions on some of the horror movies that I've watched. I'm not a huge horror fan. I don't necessarily have a lot. I came down to only have 4 unpopular opinions on horror movies, but it's better than nothing, so let's go ahead and get started talking about my unpopular opinions on some horror films. First unpopular opinion that I'm going to discuss is I don't like the Friday the 13th movie. Oddly enough, since today is Friday the 13th. This movie kind of has a cult following. The character of Jason is very popularized as much as the character of Freddy Krueger or Michael Myers from Halloween. And to be honest, I failed to see why this character seems to be so compelling to other people. It seems to be another stale slasher movie that has no intrigue in the middle. And when I first watched Friday the 13th, I thought the movie was just cheap, low budget. The acting in here was very cheesy. A lot of the prop effects were very lame. A lot of the scares in here aren't really that scary. It's the typical cliche horror slasher genre that I've seen before in other movies, and this one did not convince me to feel like it was anything scary. This movie felt very outdated, and it was really boring to watch. I didn't even watch any of the other Friday the 13th sequels because I heard that the rest of the sequels are worse than this. There are probably like couple of movies that I heard were probably just as good as this one, but since I didn't like this one, I don't think I'm going to like those other ones either. The second unpopular opinion that I have is related to A Quiet Place. People are insisting that the family should have stayed at the waterfall, but I don't see this as a flaw in the film. Really think about it. If you have a family and it's the end of the world, you're on survival, you have to live in a house. And at this waterfall, there aren't any houses that surrounded it. All of the houses that are in there are completely abandoned. The mom and dad have kids to watch over. Where are they going to be able to live? Sure, there's fishes over there that they can be able to catch, and no other creature is going to be able to find them because they detect them by hearing. But even though they can stay over there, they have to move over to other places in order to scrounge for other supplies. Scrounge for bullets in case they get robbed, scrounge for cropping materials in case they run out of food and have to supply with other stuff. They also have to keep themselves mobile and active and give themselves energy. If they don't, they're gonna die out and become a lot more depressed. It's not comfortable being isolated in one area. They have to move from other places. Maybe it's because some people are thinking this movie is fictional, which is why they're insisting that they could just live at the waterfall just because it is, but I'm looking at this film as a realistic perspective. And when I'm seeing the realism in this film, and people keep asking the question, why didn't they just stay at the waterfall? It doesn't really make much sense to me. You have to think at it in a logical perspective because all of the things that would make this family stay at the waterfall still wouldn't work. They would still be just as much danger as living somewhere else. The third unpopular opinion that I have is I think the ending to Dr. Sleep is actually great. A lot of people like to insist that the ending to Dr. Sleep is mostly just fan service, but personally, I saw it more than just that. To me, this is discovering the psychological analysis of a tortured person who used to be tormented as a kid and is going back to that realm of reality that he used to be in. His dark past and greatest fears that he's always had as a kid, he's kept bundled up inside of a little box, but everything that was displayed at the very end of the movie is him finally confronting it. Is him willing to be open to it rather than just suppressing it inside of his head and never wanting to talk about it. This is him actually dealing with the situation at hand and finally having the chance to overcome it. It's brilliantly shot and brilliantly composed in that type of perspective. Does it seem like that it would be shown as fan service? Sure, you can say that, but it doesn't feel like fan service for the sake of fan service. It feels like it's both fan service, but also serving purpose to the story it's telling. And I personally think people are not giving enough credit to the ending of Dr. Sleep as they should. And my final unpopular opinion on a horror movie is probably a big one. I don't really care for the very first It movie yet, another Stephen King film that I actually am talking about in this list of unpopular opinions I have. Stephen King stories, especially in horror, have a way of telling them, and when done correctly, they can be great stories. But over that, it's not really executing it in that type of fashion. It's executing it rather as a cheesy 80s film, and when you're combining two things that are polar opposite amongst each other, it doesn't work for me when I'm watching this movie. If this movie wanted to be good old fun and referencing stuff that are in the 80s and making it into a cheesy horror 80s film, then I would have been fine with it. But underneath it, there's a story where it's trying to be intriguing. And there are also moments where the film is actually wanting us to take it seriously because it's going to dark territories. This movie is trying to tackle two different identities. And if it would have chose one or the other, I would have really liked it. But because it's trying to do both at the exact same time, and it seems like it's going back and forth between the two, I can't really get into it that much. And now we're gonna go over towards the comments that are on my Instagram account, and already from the get-go, this comment said, "It movies are the best horror movies ever made," and I've already made my statement on why I say that they aren't. It's cool if the dude likes them. I mean, I just can't really get into that franchise that much. But this person said 2000s horror gets too much hate. It's often cited as the worst decade of horror, but I personally don't think there is a worst. It has some underrated gems and some genre classics. And some of the movies he provided are the Paranormal Activity sequels, Dawn of the Dead remake, Drag Me to Hell, and The Mist. I think during the 2000s era of horror films, there are like three things that I've noticed that would easily make people not really interested in the movie or get turned off by it and say that this movie actually is bad. Some would probably say that the effects in there are not that good, but I would also argue that the effects over time have gotten better and better because they progressed onward. I also think that some of the ideas that they had at the time are kind of neat, but now during that era, they started to do that exact same idea, and it started to become stale over a while to the point where it's now a cliche if you do this type of movie. Particularly the Paranormal Activity movies, who decided to emphasize really hard on the found footage content. I'm kind of glad where they're at now compared to where they were back then, because we've evolved a lot more often where we're able to have better ideas and more interesting ways on how to create films in general through horror genre. And with horror films in the 2000s, you could definitely have an appreciation for them and you could see something clever within the films that they were creating. But I don't think a good bit of them would last that long because they seem to be outdated with what they were trying to do. The Ring is funnier than scary. That's a thing within horror movies. Like, if it's not scary, people would cite it as funny. And I don't know if I can call that messed up, or maybe there's some dark humor towards horror films that I'm not necessarily seeing, like the Evil Dead movies. I mean, some people have decided to say that The Exorcist is actually a comedy to them. And I don't get that at all. But to be honest, I don't really have much else to say on it because I haven't really seen The Ring. What do you guys think of this comment? Do you think that The Ring is more so funny than it is scary, or do you completely disagree with this person? Really, put your thoughts down below and let's have a conversation about it. I'm actually curious to see what you guys think about this. I love Child's Play 3. I've always loved it because I love that it did something different. It changed up the setting. It made Andy a teenager instead of making him a kid again. It has an awesome main theme because the theme really fits the military setting of it, and the kills are terrific and unique, unlike most horror movies. The look of Chucky isn't bad. The characters are solid and enjoyable to watch. I never understood the hate for it, especially when people would say it's worse than Seed of Chucky. I loved watching the Child's Play movies when I was young. Even though I haven't necessarily remembered Child's Play 3 that much, I remember liking that film, but I do think that if I did go back and watch it, the idea of creating Andy as a teenager, does kind of destroy some of the fun that's in the Child's Play movies. Even though if you were to say that it's different, it doesn't necessarily bring in the joy that we used to have, at least with the first Child's Play movie. Because if a movie has a setting and the main character is a kid, it brings in the childlike innocence of fun. And when that child is no longer a kid and they grow up to be a lot older than they were before, the fun is no longer there because they're growing up and they no longer have that child mindset of innocence anymore. But then again, I haven't necessarily seen the movie in a long time, so if I rewatch it, I could probably be wrong. And this is the last comment that I've got on Instagram. My unpopular opinion is horror movies in general are usually terrible. I say about 10% of horror movies are actually scary. Most come across amusing or just rely on making the audience jump, and me jumping out from behind the sofa can make someone jump. And yeah, that's definitely an unpopular opinion, but I think that's more so subjective on making a statement on horror movies being terrible rather than saying like there's no such thing as a good movie. I think there's two things I want to come across from. First of all, if a movie is not necessarily scary, it doesn't mean that it isn't terrible. It means it's not necessarily good at its job, but you can't necessarily say that it's not a good movie. It can still be a good movie within its own merits, depending on the writing, shot, and directing and acting in the film. The second thing is that if you have a problem with horror movies and you're not necessarily scared because you always expect what you're going to expect when watching a horror movie, chances are it's probably because you don't necessarily get scared easily. It isn't because that the movie isn't scary. Horror films are usually subjective to everybody. Like for example, I created a video asking people whether or not they found the movie Hereditary to be scary or not. Some people were insisting that they thought it was one of the most disturbing films that they ever saw and it scared them for life. But other people thought that it was a really good movie, but it just wasn't scary to them at all. And the reason why this movie is so divisive on trying to scare people is because some people prefer that type of execution from Hereditary when watching a horror movie, but some people prefer something different in order for them to get scared. So when this person is saying that I think that most horror movies are bad because they're not necessarily that scary, I think it's because the dude is just not easily scared by anything. And anyways guys, that is all the unpopular opinions we're going to be able to talk about for horror movies today. Thank you all so much for watching. And what are some of your unpopular opinions on horror films or horror movies in general? And what do you think about some of the unpopular opinions that I have and the unpopular opinions that these people have on my Instagram? Put your thoughts down in the comment section below and let's have a conversation about it. And like this video if you agree with what I say, or dislike this video if you disagree with what I say. I don't mind the dislikes. So that is it I have for today's video. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll be sure to see you in the next video.